The dead do not forgive, and they do not forget. I learned this truth not from scripture or superstition, but from a letter written by a man who used his final breath to destroy me. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and in the autumn of 1889, I believed myself to be the most fortunate woman in London. I was 23 years old, possessed of a modest inheritance from my late father, and engaged to Theodore Blackwood, a barrister whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by his reputation for integrity. We were to be married in the spring, when the gardens of his family estate in Kent would bloom white with jasmine, and I would finally leave behind the quiet grief that had defined my existence since my father's death 4 years prior. I remember the precise quality of the light on the evening everything changed. It was the color of weak tea, filtering through the lace curtains of my small sitting room in Bloomsbury, where I had lived alone since my father's passing. I was embroidering forget-me-nots onto a handkerchief intended for Theodore's Christmas gift, though Christmas was still 2 months away. I liked to work slowly, to pour intention into each stitch, as if the care I took with thread might somehow translate into the life we would build together. The knock at my door came at 5:30. My housekeeper, Mrs. Bramley, announced that Mr. Blackwood had arrived without prior notice, and something in her voice made me set down my needlework with trembling fingers. Theodore was a man of schedules and appointments. He did not arrive unannounced. He did not deviate from plans without reason. When he entered my sitting room, I knew at once that something terrible had happened. His face, usually so composed, so deliberately arranged into expressions appropriate for courtrooms and drawing rooms alike, had collapsed into something raw. His dark hair was disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and his cravat was loosened in a way that would have scandalized his mother. "Theodore," I said, rising to meet him, "what has happened? You look as though you have seen a ghost." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room and took my hands in his, and I felt how cold his fingers were, how they trembled against my own. His eyes searched my face with an intensity that made my heart constrict with fear. "Henry Crowe is dead," he said finally. The words fell between us like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples I could not yet comprehend. I knew the name, of course. Henry Crowe was one of Theodore's most significant clients, an industrial magnate who had made his fortune in textile manufacturing and had spent the last decade defending that fortune against lawsuits, rivals, and the occasional parliamentary inquiry. Theodore had handled his legal affairs for 3 years and spoke of him rarely, and when he did, it was with the careful neutrality he reserved for clients whose characters he could not admire, but whose cases he could not refuse. "I am sorry," I said, because it seemed the appropriate thing to say, though I felt no particular grief for a man I had met only twice, and briefly. "How did he die?" Theodore released my hands and moved to the window, his back to me. The fading light outlined his silhouette, and I watched the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself as though bracing against a blow that had not yet fallen. "They found him in his study this morning," he said. "The servants thought he was sleeping in his chair, but when they tried to wake him for breakfast, they discovered he had been dead for hours. The physician believes it was his heart, though there will be an inquest." I waited, sensing there was more, sensing that the death of a wealthy client, however unexpected, would not have driven Theodore to my door in such a state of agitation. He turned to face me then, and the expression in his eyes was one I had never seen before. It was fear, I realized. Theodore Blackwood, who argued before judges without a tremor in his voice, who faced down hostile witnesses with cool precision, was afraid. "Before he died," Theodore said slowly, "Crowe made arrangements. He left a letter with his personal solicitor, Mr. Hartley, with explicit instructions. The letter was to be delivered to me, and I was to read it at midnight, alone, on the night of his death. Those were his exact words. At midnight, alone." A chill passed through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. There was something almost ritualistic about such instructions, something that belonged to ghost stories told around winter fires rather than to the practical world of legal documents and last wills. "And did you?" I asked. "Did you read it at midnight?" Theodore nodded, and I watched his throat move as he swallowed. "I thought it was a dying man's eccentricity," he said. Crow was always theatrical. He enjoyed drama, spectacle. I assumed the letter would contain some final instruction about his estate, perhaps some confession of a business dealing he wished me to rectify. I read it at midnight as instructed, in my chambers, by candlelight. He paused, and the silence stretched between us like a held breath. "What did it say?" I whispered. Theodore reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. The edges were creased, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times in the hours since midnight. He held it out to me, and I saw that his hand was shaking. "I think," he said, his voice barely audible, "that you should read it yourself." I took the letter from him, with fingers that had gone numb. The paper was expensive, heavy, embossed with Henry Crow's personal seal. I unfolded it carefully, as though it might crumble at my touch, and began to read. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, the script of a man writing against time, and the words blurred before my eyes as their meaning penetrated my understanding. To Theodore Blackwood, the letter began. "If you are reading this, I am dead, and I have kept silent long enough. What I am about to tell you will cause you great pain, and for that I offer no apology. The truth is owed to the dead, and I will not carry this secret into whatever darkness awaits me. Your fiancée, Eleanor Ashford, is a murderess." I stopped breathing. The room tilted around me, and I gripped the arm of my chair to steady myself. 4 years ago, the letter continued, Dr. William Ashford died in his home in Bloomsbury, attended by his devoted daughter. The physician who examined him declared the cause to be a sudden failure of the heart, a tragedy, but not a mystery. I know better. I was present at a dinner party 3 weeks before William Ashford's death, at which he confided to me, in a moment of indiscretion fueled by too much port, that he had discovered something troubling about Eleanor's mother. A secret so shameful that he intended to alter his will, to disinherit his daughter entirely, rather than allow the tainted blood to inherit his estate. He feared, he said, that the madness that had claimed his wife might already be taking root in their child. Eleanor learned of this conversation. I do not know how. Perhaps she overheard us. Perhaps one of the servants told her. But within 3 weeks, William Ashford was dead, and Eleanor inherited everything. I watched her at the funeral, Blackwood. I watched her weep with perfect restraint, accept condolences with perfect grace, and I knew, with a certainty I could not prove, that I was watching a performance. That behind those demure eyes was a mind capable of calculating murder. For 4 years, I have kept silent. I told myself it was not my concern, that I had no evidence, that accusations without proof would only bring ruin upon myself. But now I am dying. My physician has given me weeks, perhaps days, and I find I cannot meet my Maker with this knowledge locked inside me. There is more. After her father's death, Eleanor sought me out. She came to my home, unannounced, unchaperoned. She knew that I suspected her, and she attempted to secure my silence through means I will not sully this letter by describing. When I refused her advances, she threatened me. She told me that if I ever spoke of what I suspected, she would destroy me. I have kept her secret out of cowardice, but I will not let you marry a murderess unknowing. I will not let another man fall victim to her calculations. The proofs of what I say are hidden where Eleanor herself hid them, in a place she believes no one else knows. Ask her about the locked drawer in her father's study. Ask her what she keeps there still. I am sorry to burden you with this truth, but the dead deserve justice, even when the living have failed to provide it. Storito. The letter fell from my hands. I could not feel my body. I could not feel anything at all except a great roaring emptiness where my heart had been. I looked up at Theodore. and the expression on his face was worse than anything the letter had contained. It was the expression of a man who wanted desperately to disbelieve what he had read, but found himself unable to do so entirely. It was doubt. It was suspicion. It was the first crack in the foundation of everything we had built together. "Theodore," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. "This is a lie. Every word of it is a lie. I did not kill my father. I never went to Henry Crow's home. I never threatened anyone." He said nothing. He simply watched me with those dark eyes that had once looked at me with such tenderness, such certainty, and I saw the questions forming behind them, the terrible, poisonous questions that Henry Crow had planted like seeds in fertile soil. "You must believe me," I said, rising from my chair, reaching for him. "I loved my father. I would never have harmed him. I do not know why Crow would write such things, but they are false. They are monstrous lies." Theodore caught my hands before they could touch his face. He held them gently but firmly, keeping me at a distance, and that small barrier between us felt like a chasm opening in the earth. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "there is something I must ask you, and I need you to answer me truthfully, without evasion." "Anything," I whispered. "Ask me anything." His jaw tightened. "Is there a locked drawer in your father's study? A drawer that you have kept locked since his death?" The question struck me like a physical blow. Because there was. There was a locked drawer in the desk that had belonged to my father, a drawer I had never opened because I had never found the key, a drawer I had simply left alone because it seemed too painful to force it open, to disturb whatever private papers my father had kept there. "Yes," I admitted, because I could not lie to him, not even to save myself. "But I have never opened it. I do not know what is inside. I never found the key." Something flickered in Theodore's expression. It might have been relief. It might have been disappointment. I could not tell, and that uncertainty was its own kind of agony. "Then we must open it," he said. "Tonight. Together. Whatever is inside, we will face it together." I nodded, though I was shaking, though I wanted to scream that this was madness, that we should burn the letter and forget Henry Crow's dying accusations and go on as we had been, happy and hopeful and untouched by this poison. But I knew even then that such innocence was lost to us forever. The letter had done its work. The seed of doubt had been planted, and nothing would ever be quite the same between us again. We took a cab to the house in Bloomsbury where I had grown up, where my father had practiced medicine, where my mother had slowly lost her mind before being sent away to a private asylum when I was 7 years old. Mrs. Bramley remained behind, confused and concerned, and I told her only that Mr. Blackwood and I had urgent business to attend to. The house was dark when we arrived. I had closed most of the rooms after my father's death, unable to bear the emptiness of spaces that had once been filled with his presence. Only my small sitting room, my bedroom, and the kitchen were still in regular use. The rest of the house had become a museum of memory, preserved in dust and silence. Theodore lit a lamp as we entered, and the flickering light cast strange shadows on the walls of the entrance hall. I led him up the stairs to my father's study, a room I had avoided for 4 years, a room that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. The desk stood where it had always stood, a massive piece of mahogany that my father had inherited from his own father. I approached it slowly, as though it might bite, and indicated the bottom drawer on the right side. "There," I said. "That is the drawer I could never open." Theodore knelt before the desk and examined the lock. It was a simple mechanism, he said, running his fingers over the brass fittings, not designed for security, merely privacy. A letter opener should suffice. He found one on the desktop, a silver blade shaped like a dagger, and I watched as he worked the tip into the lock and twisted. There was a soft click, and the drawer slid open. For a moment, neither of us moved. The drawer contained papers, I could see that much, stacks of letters and documents bound with ribbon. Theodore reached inside and withdrew the first bundle, and as he did, something fell from between the pages and landed on the floor at my feet. I bent to retrieve it, and my blood turned to ice. It was a small glass vial, empty but stained with the residue of some dark liquid, and tied around its neck with a scrap of black ribbon was a label, written in handwriting I did not recognize. The label read, "For when the time comes." Theodore looked at me, and I looked at him, and in that moment, I felt the walls of my life crumbling around me. Because I had never seen that vial before. I had no idea how it had come to be in my father's desk. But I knew, with sickening certainty, how it would appear to a court of law, how it would appear to the man I loved. "Eleanor," Theodore said slowly, and his voice was very careful, very controlled. "Can you explain this?" "No," I whispered. "I cannot." And in the silence that followed, I heard the first stroke of midnight echoing from a church tower somewhere in the distance, as though Henry Crow himself were marking the hour of my destruction. The hours that followed dissolved into a kind of waking nightmare from which I could not rouse myself. Theodore took the vial and the contents of the drawer, wrapped them carefully in his handkerchief, and told me that he would have them examined by a chemist he trusted. He spoke to me gently, as one might speak to a frightened child or an invalid, and that gentleness was worse than accusation. It meant he was being careful with me. It meant he was no longer certain who I was. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my father's study until dawn bled gray through the windows, surrounded by the ghosts of memories I had tried so hard to preserve. My father's medical books still lined the shelves, their leather spines cracked with age and use. His pipe still rested in its stand on the mantelpiece, as though he might return at any moment to fill it with tobacco. I had kept everything exactly as it was because I could not bear to disturb the last traces of his presence. And now those same traces were being used to condemn me. I tried to remember the weeks before his death with clarity, but grief had blurred the details into impressionistic smears of feeling rather than fact. I remembered that he had been tired, that he had complained of pains in his chest, that he had been quieter than usual, more withdrawn. I remembered bringing him tea in the evenings and reading to him from the newspapers when his eyes grew too weary for small print. I remembered the last night when I had kissed his forehead and wished him pleasant dreams, never knowing that he would not wake to see the morning. The physician had been so certain. A failure of the heart, he had said, not uncommon in men of his age who had worked too hard and worried too much. I had accepted the diagnosis without question, because it made sense, because my father had always pushed himself beyond reasonable limits, because his health had never been robust since my mother's illness had broken something inside him. But now, in the gray light of this terrible dawn, I found myself questioning everything. Had there been signs I had missed? Had my father known something was wrong, something beyond the ordinary complaints of an aging body? And the dinner party that Henry Crow had mentioned, the one where my father had supposedly spoken of disinheriting me, of some shameful secret about my mother, had that actually happened? I had no memory of such an event, but I had not accompanied my father to every social engagement. He had maintained his own circle of acquaintances, professional colleagues and old friends, and I had not always known where he went or with whom he spoke. The secret about my mother troubled me most of all. I knew so little of her, only fragments of memory from early childhood, the scent of her perfume, the sound of her laughter, the way she had held me in her arms and sung lullabies in a language I did not understand. She had been taken away when I was 7, committed to an asylum after what my father called a complete nervous collapse, and I had never seen her again. She died 3 years later, and my father had refused to speak of her afterward. When I asked questions, he would grow pale and silent. And eventually I stopped asking. I learned to live with the absence, the not knowing, as one learns to live with any chronic wound. What secret could possibly have been shameful enough to make my father consider disinheriting me? What tainted blood had Henry Crowe meant? The questions circled in my mind like vultures waiting for something to die. Theodore returned in the early afternoon, and I could read nothing in his expression. He had schooled his features into the same careful neutrality he used in courtrooms, and I hated him a little for that, even as I understood why it was necessary. "The chemist has examined the vial," he said, settling into the chair across from mine in the sitting room. Mrs. Bramley had brought tea, but neither of us had touched it. "The residue is consistent with a preparation of digitalis. In small doses, it is used medicinally for conditions of the heart. In larger doses, it can cause death that mimics natural cardiac failure." I heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away. Digitalis, the foxglove poison. I knew of it, of course. My father had been a physician, and I had grown up surrounded by medical texts and discussions of treatments and remedies. Digitalis was common, easily obtained, and nearly impossible to detect in a body that had been buried. "My father kept digitalis in his medical bag," I said slowly, forcing myself to think clearly despite the terror clawing at my chest. "He used it to treat patients with weak hearts. Anyone could have taken it." Theodore nodded. "That is true. And it is also true that the presence of the vial proves nothing. It could have been placed in that drawer by anyone, at any time, for any number of reasons." "But you do not believe that," I said. He was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together, and he looked at me with an expression that was equal parts anguish and determination. "Eleanor, I want to believe you," he said. "I want to believe that every word in Crowe's letter was a lie, that the vial means nothing, that you are exactly who I have always thought you to be. But I am a barrister. I have spent my career building cases from evidence, separating truth from falsehood, and I cannot simply ignore what has been placed before me. I must investigate. I must know the truth, whatever it may be. Even if the truth destroys us?" I asked, and my voice broke on the final word. He reached across the space between us and took my hand. His fingers were warm now, steady, and I clung to that steadiness as though it were the only solid ground in a world that had become quicksand. "If you are innocent," he said quietly, "then the truth will set us free. And if you are not, then I need to know. Not to condemn you, but to understand, to decide what kind of man I want to be, what kind of life I can live, knowing what I know." I wanted to rage at him. I wanted to scream that love should be enough, that faith should be enough, that he should look into my eyes and see the truth written there without needing evidence or investigation or proof. But I knew, even in my anguish, that he was right. He was a man of law, of reason, of evidence. He could not simply choose to believe me without examining the facts, any more than I could choose to stop breathing. It was who he was, and I had loved him for it. "Then investigate," I said, withdrawing my hand from his. "Ask your questions. Examine your evidence. But know this, Theodore. I did not kill my father. And when you have finished your investigation, when you have turned over every stone and examined every shadow, you will know it too." He rose to leave, and at the door he paused, his hand on the frame, his back to me. "There is something else," he said. "In the letters we found in the drawer. Correspondence between your father and Henry Crowe, spanning several years. Some of it is," he hesitated, searching for the right word, "troubling. I will need to read them more carefully, but there are references to your mother, to some arrangement made before her death. And there are mentions of payments, large sums of money, transferred from Crowe to your father at irregular intervals." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What kind of payments? What kind of arrangement?" "I do not yet know," Theodore said, "but I intend to find out." He left, and I sat alone in my sitting room as the afternoon light faded into evening, as Mrs. Bramley lit the lamps and brought me supper I could not eat, as the clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the hours of my life with mechanical indifference. I knew I could not simply wait for Theodore to uncover the truth. If I was to save myself, I would need to investigate as well. I would need to find answers to questions I had never thought to ask. About my father, about my mother, about the strange connection between our family and Henry Crowe. And I would need to start with the one person who might still remember what had happened all those years ago. The next morning, I took a cab to the asylum where my mother had spent the final years of her life. Holloway Sanatorium was located in Surrey, a Gothic monstrosity of red brick and pointed arches that had been designed to look impressive rather than welcoming. I had visited only once before, for my mother's funeral, and I had sworn never to return. But desperate circumstances required desperate measures. The superintendent, a Dr. Elias Marsh, received me in his office with an expression of professional sympathy that I suspected he practiced in front of a mirror. "Miss Ashford," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "I must confess, I am surprised to see you here. It has been, 16 years since your mother's passing?" 17, I corrected him, "and I apologize for arriving without notice. But I find myself in need of information about my mother's time here, and I did not know where else to turn." Dr. Marsh steepled his fingers and regarded me with eyes that were sharp, despite his benevolent demeanor. "What sort of information?" I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "The circumstances of her illness," I said finally. "The nature of her condition. My father never spoke of it, and I have recently learned that there may have been more to her story than I was told." The superintendent was silent for a long moment. Then he rose and crossed to a cabinet in the corner of his office, from which he withdrew a thick file bound in faded cardboard. "Your mother was a patient here for 3 years before her death," he said, returning to his desk with the file. "Her case was," he paused, searching for the appropriate word, "unusual." "Unusual how?" Dr. Marsh opened the file and began to leaf through the yellowed pages within. She was admitted in 1872, suffering from what we then called hysteria with religious mania. She experienced visions, heard voices, claimed to receive messages from the dead. She was convinced that she had been chosen for some divine purpose, though the nature of that purpose changed frequently. My heart was pounding. I had known my mother was ill, but I had never known the details of her illness. Religious mania, voices, visions. Was this the tainted blood that Henry Crowe had mentioned? Was she, I forced myself to ask the question, was she violent? Dr. Marsh's expression softened. No, never. She was gentle, almost childlike in her final years. The voices she heard were comforting to her, not threatening. She believed she was communicating with angels, with spirits of the departed. She spent most of her time writing, filling notebooks with what she called messages from beyond. I leaned forward. "Do those notebooks still exist?" The superintendent hesitated. "They should be in the archive," he said slowly. "We keep records of all patient materials, though I confess they are rarely consulted." He paused, studying my face. "Miss Ashford, may I ask why you are seeking this information now, after so many years?" I considered lying, but something in his expression told me that he already suspected there was more to my visit than simple curiosity. "My mother's illness has been used to make accusations against me," I said carefully. "Accusations that I must disprove. I need to understand who she was, what she believed, and whether there is any truth to the suggestion that her condition might be." I struggled to find the right words. Hereditary. Dr. Marsh closed the file and regarded me with something that might have been compassion. "Mental illness is a mysterious affliction," he said quietly. "We understand so little of its origins. Some physicians believe it runs in families, passed down through blood like the color of eyes or the shape of a nose. Others believe it is caused by external factors, by trauma or shock or moral failing. In my experience, the truth is rarely simple." He rose and moved to the door. "Wait here," he said. "I will see if the notebooks can be located." He was gone for nearly an hour. I sat in his office, surrounded by certificates and diplomas and the faint smell of carbolic acid, and I thought about my mother. I had so few memories of her, and those I had were fragmented, dreamlike. The softness of her voice, the darkness of her hair, the way she had cried when they took her away, reaching for me through the window of the carriage as my father held me back. I had always believed that she was taken because she was sick, because she needed help that could not be provided at home. But now I wondered if there had been more to it. Payments from Henry Crowe to my father, arrangements made before her death. What had my father been hiding? Dr. Marsh returned with a wooden box tucked under his arm. The notebooks, he said, setting the box on his desk. There are 7 of them, spanning the 3 years of her residency. I must ask that you examine them here, under supervision. They cannot leave the premises. I understood. I opened the box with trembling hands and withdrew the first notebook. The pages were filled with my mother's handwriting, a cramped and urgent script that slanted sharply to the right. The early entries were disjointed, fragmentary, filled with references to voices and visions that made little sense. But as I read further, a pattern began to emerge. She was writing letters to the dead. My dearest Elizabeth, one entry began, I received your message last night, as clear as if you were standing beside me. You say that he will come for me soon, that the time of reckoning approaches. I am not afraid. I have made my peace with what I have done, and I know that you have forgiven me. Who was Elizabeth, and what had my mother done that required forgiveness? I turned the pages faster, scanning for any mention of my father, of Henry Crowe, of the secret that had apparently haunted our family for so long. And then, near the end of the 5th notebook, I found it. He came again today, my mother had written. William brought him, though I begged him not to. Henry Crowe, with his cold eyes and his colder heart. He wanted to know if I had told anyone. I said no, because what would be the point? No one would believe me. No one believes the mad. But I know the truth, and so does William, and so does Crowe. And one day the truth will come out. Elizabeth tells me so. She says that the dead cannot be silenced forever. I read the passage 3 times, my heart racing. My father had brought Henry Crowe to visit my mother in the asylum. Why? What truth was she referring to? And who was Elizabeth? I turned to the final notebook, but before I could open it, Dr. Marsh cleared his throat. Miss Ashford, he said, glancing at the clock on his wall, I am afraid visiting hours are nearly over. You may return tomorrow if you wish to continue your examination. I wanted to protest, to beg for more time, but I could see from his expression that it would be useless. I closed the notebook and replaced it in the box, my mind churning with questions. Thank you, I said, rising to leave. You have been very kind. At the door, I paused, struck by a sudden thought. Dr. Marsh, I asked, do your records indicate who paid for my mother's care here? The fees for such an institution must have been substantial. The superintendent frowned, then opened the file once more and consulted a page near the front. According to our records, he said slowly, your mother's care was paid for by a Mr. Henry Crowe with the approval of your father. He looked up at me with curiosity plain on his face. I assumed he was a family friend. I said nothing. I could not have spoken if I had tried. I simply nodded my thanks and walked out into the gray afternoon, where a light rain had begun to fall, veiling the Gothic towers of the asylum in mist. Henry Crowe had paid for my mother's care. Henry Crowe, who had accused me of murder. Henry Crowe, who had written of tainted blood and shameful secrets. What hold had he possessed over my family? What debt had my father owed him? And what truth had my mother known, the truth that the dead could not silence forever? I returned to London as darkness fell, my thoughts tangled like thread in a broken loom. When I arrived at my house in Bloomsbury, I found Theodore waiting for me on the doorstep. his face pale and grave in the lamplight. "Where have you been?" he asked, and there was an edge to his voice that I had not heard before. "I have been looking for you all day." "I went to Surrey," I said, "to the asylum where my mother was kept." I needed to understand. His expression flickered. "You should not be investigating on your own," he said. "If you are seen asking questions, it could be interpreted as consciousness of guilt." I felt a flash of anger. Should I simply sit in my parlor and wait for others to determine my fate? Should I trust that truth and justice will prevail when a dead man has already convinced you to doubt me? Theodore flinched as though I had struck him. "That is not fair," he said quietly. "I am trying to help you." "Then help me," I said, my voice breaking. "Tell me what you have found in those letters. Tell me what connection existed between my father and Henry Crowe. Tell me what they were hiding, because I am beginning to believe it was something monstrous." He was silent for a long moment. Then he took my arm and guided me inside, out of the rain and the cold, into the warmth of my sitting room where a fire crackled in the grate. "I have read the letters," he said, settling into a chair across from me. "All of them. And what they reveal is," he paused, his jaw tightening, "complicated. Tell me." Theodore met my eyes, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It was not doubt this time. It was pity. "Your mother," he said slowly, "was not mad, or rather, her madness was not the cause of her confinement. She was placed in the asylum because she knew something that your father and Henry Crowe could not allow her to reveal." "What?" I whispered. "What did she know?" Theodore leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There was a woman named Elizabeth Reed. She died 25 years ago, in circumstances that were ruled accidental. But your mother believed, and the letters suggest your father eventually came to share that belief, that Elizabeth Reed was murdered, and that Henry Crowe was responsible." The room seemed to tilt around me. Elizabeth. The name from my mother's notebooks, the spirit she claimed to communicate with. "Why?" I asked. "Why would Crowe kill her?" Theodore shook his head. "That I do not yet know. But I believe that your mother witnessed something, or discovered something, that made her a threat to Crowe. He had her committed to silence her, and he paid for her care to ensure she remained silenced. Your father went along with the arrangement because here," Theodore's voice faltered, "because Crowe threatened to destroy him if he did not." I felt tears streaming down my face, though I had not been aware of crying. My mother, my poor mother, locked away for 17 years, not because she was mad, but because she knew too much. "And my father?" I asked. "Did he really intend to disinherit me?" "I do not know," Theodore admitted. "The letters do not mention it, but they do suggest that your father had grown increasingly troubled in the years before his death. He wrote to Crowe several times, demanding to be released from their arrangement. He threatened to go to the police, to tell the truth about Elizabeth Reed. And Crowe," his voice hardened, "Crowe wrote back, reminding him of what he stood to lose." Theodore reached into his coat and withdrew a letter, folded and creased. "This was among the papers in the drawer," he said. "It is dated 3 weeks before your father's death." I took the letter with hands that would not stop shaking and read the words written in Henry Crowe's distinctive hand. "My dear William," the letter began, "I understand your distress, but I must remind you that our arrangement serves us both. If you go to the police, you will implicate yourself as deeply as you implicate me. You were the one who signed the commitment papers. You were the one who accepted my money year after year to keep your wife locked away. And you were the one who helped me dispose of the evidence all those years ago. If the truth comes out, we hang together. Is that what you want? Is that the legacy you wish to leave your daughter?" I looked up at Theodore, my vision blurred with tears. He helped Crowe. My father helped him cover up a murder. "It appears so," Theodore said softly. "And I believe, though I cannot yet prove it, that your father was killed to prevent him from confessing. The question is, Who killed him? And why has Crow, from beyond the grave, tried to place the blame on you? I had no answers, only questions, spiraling endlessly into darkness. But one thing had become clear to me, as clear as the cold rain still falling outside my window. My father had not been the man I believed him to be. And the truth about his death, about my mother's imprisonment, about the woman named Elizabeth Reed, was still waiting to be discovered. I would find it, no matter what it cost me, even if it cost me everything I had left to lose. The name Elizabeth Reed became my obsession in the days that followed. I searched my father's papers, his correspondence, his medical records, looking for any mention of her, any clue that might explain who she had been and why her death had cast such a long shadow over my family. Theodore searched as well, using his connections in the legal world to access court records and police files. And together we began to piece together a picture of a woman who had been erased from history. Elizabeth Reed had been a governess. She had worked for the Crow family in the autumn of 1864, caring for Henry Crow's younger sister, a girl of 12 named Violet. She had been 23 years old, educated, respectable, and by all accounts devoted to her charge. She had died on the 15th of November of that year, found at the bottom of a staircase in the Crow family home with her neck broken. The inquest had ruled it an accident, a loose carpet, a moment of carelessness, a tragedy, but not a crime, except that my mother had believed otherwise, and my father, it seemed, had eventually come to share that belief. I returned to the asylum twice more, reading through my mother's notebooks with a desperation that bordered on mania. The entries about Elizabeth were scattered throughout, fragments of conversation that my mother claimed to have received from beyond the grave. Most were incoherent, ravings about angels and judgment and the weight of secrets, but some were disturbingly specific. She was carrying his child, my mother had written in one entry. That was why he killed her. She thought he would marry her, the foolish girl. She did not understand that men like Henry Crow do not marry governesses. They use them and discard them, and when discarding becomes inconvenient, they find other solutions. I read those words with a sick feeling in my stomach. If they were true, if Elizabeth Reed had been pregnant with Crow's child, then her death took on an entirely different complexion. It was not an accident. It was murder, committed to protect a wealthy man's reputation and prospects. But how had my mother known? And what role had my father played in the cover-up? The answers came from an unexpected source. I had been corresponding with Dr. Marsh at the asylum, asking if there were any other materials related to my mother's case that I might examine. He had been helpful, if somewhat puzzled by my persistence, and on my fourth visit to Surrey, he presented me with a box of items that had been found among my mother's possessions after her death. These were never claimed, he explained. Your father was, forgive me, in no state to deal with such matters at the time. The box was placed in storage and forgotten. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were personal effects, a hairbrush, a hand mirror, a rosary made of jet beads, and beneath them, wrapped in a faded silk scarf, was a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. The letters were addressed to my mother, but the handwriting was not my father's. It was a woman's script, delicate and precise, and the signature at the bottom of each letter was the same. Your devoted friend, Elizabeth. I nearly dropped the bundle. Elizabeth Reed had written to my mother. They had known each other. They had been friends. I read the letters in chronological order, and a story emerged that made my heart ache with its simplicity and its tragedy. Elizabeth Reed had met my mother in 1863, when both were young women living in London. My mother, then Catherine Wells, had been the daughter of a respectable but impoverished clergyman. Elizabeth was the daughter of a schoolteacher, equally respectable, equally poor. They had met at a lecture on poetry and formed an immediate bond. Two intelligent women trapped by the limitations of their sex and their circumstances. The letters chronicled their friendship over the course of 2 years. Elizabeth had taken the position with the Crow family because she needed the income, and her letters from that household grew increasingly troubled as the months passed. "He watches me," Elizabeth wrote in one letter dated August 1864. "Crow, I mean. He finds excuses to come to the schoolroom when I am alone with Violet. He asks me questions about my life, my family, my hopes for the future. He is handsome and charming, and I know I should not encourage his attention. But Catherine, I am so lonely here. The other servants despise me because I am educated. The family treats me as furniture, and he looks at me as though I am a person, as though I matter." By October, the tone of the letters had shifted. "I have been foolish," Elizabeth wrote. "I have been so terribly foolish. He promised me everything, Catherine. A house of my own, a life of comfort, a future where I would never have to work again. And I believed him, because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. But now I am carrying his child, and everything has changed. He no longer looks at me with warmth. He looks at me with fear. He says we must find a solution, that no one can know, that his family would be ruined if the truth emerged. I do not know what to do. I am so frightened." The final letter was dated November 10th, 1864, 5 days before Elizabeth's death. "He has made his position clear," she wrote. "He will not marry me. He will not acknowledge the child. He has offered me money to go away, to disappear somewhere in the countryside and have the baby in secret, and then to give it up to an orphanage. He says it is the only way. He says that if I refuse, if I make trouble, he will destroy me. He will tell everyone that I am a whore who seduced him, that I am trying to extort money from a respectable family, that I deserve to be cast out into the streets. Catherine, I do not know what to do. I have no one else to turn to. Please, if anything happens to me, please remember the truth. Please do not let him escape justice." I sat in Dr. Marsh's office, the letters spread before me, and I wept. I wept for Elizabeth Reed, a young woman who had made a terrible mistake and paid for it with her life. I wept for my mother, who had carried the knowledge of her friend's murder for years, who had been silenced and imprisoned because she refused to forget. And I wept for myself, because I finally understood why Henry Crow had chosen to destroy me from beyond the grave. He had killed Elizabeth Reed, and my mother had known. My father had helped him cover it up, either through cowardice or complicity, or some combination of both. For 25 years, the secret had remained buried, and when my father had threatened to expose it, Crow had silenced him as well. But why accuse me? Why, in his dying letter, had Crow pointed the finger at me rather than simply letting the secret die with him? The answer came to me slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. Crow had not known about the letters. He had not known that Elizabeth had written to my mother, that evidence of his crime still existed. He had believed that by silencing my father and imprisoning my mother, he had eliminated all proof of what he had done. But he had feared my mother's notebooks. He had known that she wrote constantly, obsessively, filling pages with her visions and her voices. He had worried that somewhere in those ravings there might be something that could incriminate him, and so he had constructed a final contingency. If anyone ever investigated my mother's writings, if anyone ever came close to the truth, they would find instead a different story, a story in which Eleanor Ashford was a murderess, in which the daughter had inherited the mother's madness and used it to kill. The accusation against me was not about justice, it was about misdirection. Crow had intended to taint any investigation before it could begin, to ensure that anyone who dug into the past would find not his guilt, but mine. I gathered the letters and rose to leave, my mind racing with plans. I would take this evidence to Theodore. Together, we would build a case, not against me, but against the memory of Henry Crow. We would clear my name and my mother's name and restore honor to my family. But when I arrived at Theodore's chambers that evening, I found not salvation, but another blow. He was standing at his window, his back to the door, and he did not turn when I entered. On his desk lay a newspaper, folded open to an article that I could not read from where I stood. "Theodore," I said, my voice bright with excitement despite his somber posture. "I have found something extraordinary. Letters from Elizabeth Reed to my mother, proving that Crow murdered her. We can—" I stopped, finally registering the tension in his shoulders, the stillness of his stance. "What has happened?" He turned then, and his face was ashen. "Someone has spoken to the press," he said quietly, "about Crow's letter, about the accusation against you." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" Theodore crossed to his desk and picked up the newspaper, holding it out to me. I took it with numb fingers and read the headline that would change everything. "Barrister's fiancée accused of murder by dying client. Shocking letter reveals patricide and seduction." The article that followed was sensational, lurid, filled with speculation and innuendo. It named me by name. It quoted passages from Crow's letter that should have remained private. It painted me as a black widow, a calculating murderess who had killed her own father and attempted to seduce a wealthy man to cover her crimes. "By tomorrow morning," Theodore said, his voice hollow, "this will be in every newspaper in London. By the end of the week, it will have spread across the country." I could not breathe. The letters in my hand, Elizabeth's letters, suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. What did they matter now? Who would believe the ravings of a madwoman and the correspondence of a dead governess when confronted with the titillating scandal of a beautiful young murderess? "Who?" I managed to whisper. "Who told them?" Theodore shook his head. "I do not know. Only a handful of people knew about the letter. Myself, Crow's solicitor, Mr. Hartley, the chemist who examined the vial. Someone must have been paid, or perhaps blackmailed, into revealing the contents." I thought of Mr. Hartley, the solicitor who had delivered Crow's letter with such grave ceremony. I thought of how carefully the instructions had been followed, how precisely midnight had been specified, as though Crow had been orchestrating events from beyond the grave. And then I thought of someone else. "Crow had a sister," I said slowly. "Violet. The girl Elizabeth was governess to. She would be, I calculated quickly, 37 years old now. Do you know what became of her?" Theodore frowned. "I have not looked into her. She was mentioned in the letters, but only in passing." "Why?" "Because someone wanted this story to become public," I said. "Someone wanted the accusation against me to spread as widely as possible, to ensure that even if I proved my innocence, the scandal would follow me forever. That is not the action of a solicitor seeking payment. That is the action of someone who hates me, someone who wants me destroyed." "And you believe it is Violet Crow?" "I do not know," I admitted. "But she is the only person still living who was connected to both Elizabeth's death and my mother's imprisonment. If she knows something, if she has been involved in this conspiracy, then she may be the key to unraveling it." Theodore was silent for a long moment. Then he moved to his desk and began to shuffle through papers. "I will find her," he said. "There must be records, a marriage certificate, property holdings, something that will tell us where she is now." He paused, looking up at me with an expression that was difficult to read. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something. Ask me anything. Do you believe, truly believe, that your father helped cover up Elizabeth Reed's murder? That he was complicit in imprisoning your mother to keep her silent?" I felt the weight of the question pressing down on me like a physical force. It was the question I had been avoiding, the question that cut to the very heart of who I was and who I had believed my father to be. "Yes," I said finally, and the word tasted like ashes in my mouth. "I believe he was a coward. I believe he made a terrible choice many years ago and spent the rest of his life paying for it. I believe he loved me, in his way, but that his love was poisoned by guilt and fear. And I believe," she paused, forcing herself to continue, "I believe that when he finally tried to make things right, someone killed him for it." Theodore crossed the room and took my hands in his. It was the first time he had touched me with real tenderness since the nightmare began, and I felt tears spring to my eyes. "I believe you," he said quietly. "I do not yet have proof, but I believe you, and I will help you find the truth, whatever it takes." I wanted to collapse into his arms, to let him hold me and tell me that everything would be well. But there was no time for such comfort. The newspaper article had changed everything. By tomorrow, I would be the most infamous woman in London. Every door would be closed to me, every friend would turn away, every hope I had ever held for a normal life would be extinguished, unless I could prove, beyond any doubt, that Henry Crowe was the true murderer. We worked through the night, Theodore and I, reading through every document, every letter, every scrap of paper that might contain a clue. By dawn, we had a plan. Theodore would track down Violet Crowe and discover what she knew. I would return to the asylum one final time to search for any evidence my mother might have hidden, any proof that could corroborate the story Elizabeth had told in her letters. And if the press wanted a scandal, we would give them one, but not the scandal they expected. We would give them the truth. As the first gray light of morning crept through the windows of Theodore's chambers, he walked me to the door. We stood there for a moment, facing each other, and I saw in his eyes a reflection of my own exhaustion, my own determination, my own desperate hope. "Eleanor," he said softly, "whatever happens, whatever we discover, I want you to know something." "What?" He raised his hand and touched my cheek, his fingers gentle against my skin. "I have never stopped loving you," he said. "Not for a moment. When I read that letter, when doubt crept into my heart, it was the worst pain I have ever known. Not because I believed you guilty, but because I feared I might lose you. And I cannot lose you. I will not." I turned my face into his palm, pressing my lips against his wrist, feeling the pulse of his blood beneath my mouth. Then, "Help me fight," I whispered. "Help me clear my name. And when this is over, when the truth has finally been told, marry me anyway. Marry me despite the scandal, despite the whispers, despite everything they will say." Theodore leaned down and pressed his forehead against mine, his breath warm on my lips. "I will marry you," he said, "if you will still have me. If you can forgive me for doubting, even for a moment." "There is nothing to forgive," I told him. "You are a man who seeks truth. I would not have you any other way." We parted then, each to our separate tasks, and I walked out into a London that did not yet know my name, but soon would. The fog had rolled in overnight, thick and gray and suffocating, and as I made my way through the shrouded streets, I felt as though I were walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare from which I could not wake. But I was no longer afraid. I had the truth on my side. And I had Theodore, and together we would uncover the secrets that had poisoned my family for a quarter century. The dead had spoken. Now it was time for the living to answer. The scandal broke over London like a summer storm, sudden and merciless and impossible to escape. Within 2 days of the newspaper article, my name had become synonymous with treachery and murder. I received letters, dozens of them, slipped under my door or delivered by post, filled with accusations and threats and gleeful predictions of my ruin. Mrs. Bramley, loyal to the last, burned most of them before I could read them, but I saw enough to understand the depth of public hatred that had been unleashed against me. I did not leave my house. I could not. The one time I attempted to walk to the corner to purchase bread, I was followed by a crowd of onlookers who shouted insults and threw rotten vegetables. A constable had to escort me back to my door, and even he looked at me with barely concealed disgust. Theodore came to see me each evening, slipping through the servants' entrance to avoid the reporters who had taken up permanent residence on my front steps. He brought news of his investigation, and each report brought us closer to the truth, even as it revealed new horrors. He had found Violet Crowe. She lives in Hampstead now, he told me on the third evening. settling into the chair across from mine with the weariness of a man who had not slept properly in days. She married a solicitor named Arthur Pemberton 15 years ago. They have no children. She is, by all accounts, a respectable woman of means, active in charitable work, and well regarded in her community. Does she know about Elizabeth? I asked. Theodore's expression darkened. She knows everything. I paid her a visit this afternoon, under the pretense of discussing a legal matter related to her brother's estate. When I mentioned Elizabeth Reed's name, her face went white as chalk. She tried to deny any knowledge, but she is not a skilled liar. I pressed her, and eventually she admitted that she remembers Elizabeth well. She was, after all, her governess for nearly a year. What did she say? Theodore leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. She said that Elizabeth was kind to her, that she loved her in the way a lonely child loves anyone who shows them attention. She said that when Elizabeth died, she was devastated. And she said, his voice dropped, that she saw something on the night of Elizabeth's death, something she has never told anyone. I held my breath. What did she see? She saw her brother at the top of the stairs, Theodore said quietly, just before Elizabeth fell. She was only 12 years old, and she did not understand what she was seeing at the time. But she remembers Henry standing at the top of the staircase, and she remembers Elizabeth screaming, and then she remembers the terrible sound of the fall. Afterward, Henry told her that Elizabeth had tripped, that it was a tragic accident, and that she must never speak of what she had witnessed. He told her that if she said anything, people would think she was lying, that they would send her away to a school for troubled children, that she would never see her family again. Dear God, I whispered, she has known all along. She has known for 25 years that her brother murdered Elizabeth. Theodore nodded grimly. And she has kept silent out of fear and loyalty and perhaps a desperate desire to believe it was not true. But when I told her about the letters, about Elizabeth's pregnancy, about the accusations against you, something broke in her. She wept, Eleanor. She wept like a woman releasing a lifetime of grief. Will she testify? I asked, hardly daring to hope. Will she tell the truth publicly? She is afraid, Theodore admitted. Her husband does not know about any of this. If she comes forward, her entire life will be upended. The scandal will touch her as surely as it has touched you. But without her testimony, I said, we have only circumstantial evidence. Letters from a woman who has been dead for 25 years. The ravings of my mother, who was declared insane, a vial that could have been planted by anyone. It is not enough. I know. Theodore rose and began to pace, his long strides eating up the small space of my sitting room. That is why I have asked Violet to meet with you, tomorrow evening, here, in private. I believe that if she speaks with you, if she sees that you are not the monster the newspapers have made you out to be, she may find the courage to come forward. I felt a flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in a drafty room. And if she does not? Then we find another way, Theodore said firmly. We do not surrender. We do not give up. Henry Crowe spent his life manipulating others, controlling the narrative, silencing anyone who threatened to expose him. I will not let him win from beyond the grave. I rose and went to him, taking his hands in mine. He stopped pacing and looked down at me, and in his eyes I saw exhaustion and determination and something else, something that made my heart clench with painful tenderness. You have risked so much for me, I said softly. Your reputation, your career, your standing in society. Why? Theodore's jaw tightened. Because I love you, he said simply. Because when I imagine my life without you, I see only emptiness. Because you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and I will not stand by while lies and malice destroy you. Even if I were guilty? I asked, needing to hear his answer, needing to know for certain. even if everything Crow wrote were true? He was silent for a long moment. Then he raised our joined hands and pressed his lips to my knuckles, a gesture so tender it brought tears to my eyes. "If you were guilty," he said quietly, "I would want to understand why. I would want to know what drove you to such an act. And then I would have to make a choice between my duty to the law and my love for you." He paused, his eyes searching my face. "But you are not guilty. I know this as surely as I know my own name, and so the question is meaningless." I leaned into him then, resting my forehead against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his coat. He wrapped his arms around me and held me, and for a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to feel safe. The meeting with Violet Pemberton took place the following evening in the shadowed privacy of my sitting room. She arrived alone, heavily veiled, her movements quick and nervous as a sparrow sensing a hawk nearby. When she lifted her veil, I saw a woman whose face still bore traces of the pretty child she must once have been, now hardened by years of secret-keeping and suppressed guilt. "Miss Ashford," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I should not be here. If my husband knew, if anyone saw me enter this house, the consequences would be catastrophic." "I understand," I said gently, "and I am grateful that you came despite the risk. Please sit. Let me offer you tea." We sat across from each other, two women bound by a tragedy neither of us had caused, and I waited for her to speak. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words, until finally Violet set down her untouched teacup and met my eyes. "I have hated you," she said quietly. "For months, ever since Henry told me he intended to destroy you, I have hated you without knowing who you were." I felt a chill run down my spine. "He told you? Before he died?" Violet nodded, her fingers twisting in her lap. "He came to see me in September, just after the doctors told him his heart was failing. He was calm, almost cheerful, in a way that frightened me. He said he had one final piece of business to attend to, one last loose end to tie up before he could die in peace. He said there was a woman, the daughter of William Ashford, who posed a threat to our family's reputation. He said he had written a letter that would ensure she could never harm us." I listened with growing horror. "He told you he intended to accuse me of murder?" "He told me he intended to protect us," Violet said, her voice trembling. "He said that your mother had known things, dangerous things, and that you might have inherited her knowledge. He said he could not risk you discovering the truth after he was gone. He said," she paused, swallowing hard, "he said it was necessary. That sacrifices had to be made for the greater good." "The greater good," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. A woman locked away for 17 years. My father, living in fear and guilt until someone murdered him. Elizabeth Reed, thrown down a staircase because she carried an inconvenient child. "This is your brother's idea of the greater good?" Violet flinched as though I had struck her. "You do not understand," she said, and there was a desperate pleading in her voice. "Henry was not a monster. He was complicated. He did terrible things, yes, but he also loved me. He protected me. After our parents died, he was all I had. I know it sounds mad, but I loved him too, in spite of everything." I looked at this woman, this frightened, guilt-ridden woman who had spent her entire adult life protecting a murderer because he was her brother, and I felt something I had not expected. I felt pity. "Mrs. Pemberton," I said gently. "Violet, I do not ask you to condemn your brother. I do not ask you to hate him or to forget the love you shared. I ask only that you tell the truth. Not for my sake, but for Elizabeth's. She deserves justice, even now, even after all these years. She deserves to be remembered as the victim she was, not forgotten as a cautionary tale about governesses who overstep their bounds." Tears were streaming down Violet's face now, silent and steady. "I was 12 years old," she whispered. "I saw him push her. I saw the expression on his face, the cold calculation, and then I heard her scream, and then there was nothing but silence. I have heard that silence every night for 25 years. It follows me into my dreams. It waits for me when I wake. I reached across the space between us and took her hand. It was cold and trembling, like a small animal caught in a trap. "Then let it end," I said softly. "Let the silence end. Tell the truth and free yourself as well as me." Violet looked at me for a long moment, her eyes red-rimmed and searching, and then, slowly, she nodded. "I will do it," she said. "I will tell the police what I saw. I will testify, if it comes to that. I will." She drew a shaky breath. "I will finally tell the truth." The relief that flooded through me was so intense, I nearly wept. "Thank you," I managed to say. "Thank you." But Violet held up her hand. "There is something else," she said. "Something I have not told Mr. Blackwood. Something that may change everything." I felt my heart begin to race again. "What is it?" Violet reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. "I found this among Henry's papers after he died," she said. "He kept a private study, locked, that I was never permitted to enter. After the funeral, I used the spare key to search it. I do not know what I was looking for. Proof, perhaps, that I had been wrong about him all along. Instead, I found this." She handed me the paper, and I unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a letter, written in my father's hand, dated 1 week before his death. "My dear Crow," the letter began, "I can no longer live with what we have done. I have made my decision, and nothing you say or threaten will change it. Tomorrow I intend to go to Scotland Yard and tell them everything. Elizabeth's death, Catherine's imprisonment, the payments, all of it. I know this will destroy us both, but I no longer care. I would rather hang as a murderer's accomplice than continue to live as a coward. Forgive me or do not. It no longer matters. This ends now." I read the letter twice, 3 times, my mind reeling with the implications. My father had intended to confess. He had written to Crow, warning him of his plans. And 1 week later, he was dead. "He killed him," I whispered. "Crow murdered my father, just as he murdered Elizabeth." Violet nodded, her face pale and drawn. "I believe so. Henry would never have allowed himself to be exposed. He would have done anything to protect the family name, the family fortune, the life he had built. Anything. Including framing me for the murder he himself committed," I said. "Including that." Violet agreed. She paused, then added quietly, "There is something else in that study. A box of documents, payments to physicians, to solicitors, to servants, records of bribes and threats and cover-ups spanning decades. Everything Henry did to protect himself, meticulously documented. I believe he kept it as insurance, evidence he could use against others if they ever turned on him. But now," she met my eyes, "now it can be used against him." "Where is this box?" Theodore asked. He had been standing in the doorway, listening in silence, and now he stepped forward, his expression intent. "At my home," Violet said, "hidden in the same study where I found the letter. I did not dare move it, for fear my husband would notice. But if you can come tonight, after Arthur has gone to bed, I can give it to you." Theodore looked at me, and I saw in his eyes the same fierce hope that was burning in my own heart. "We will come," he said, "tonight." The hours until midnight passed with agonizing slowness. Theodore and I sat together in my darkened sitting room, speaking little, our hands intertwined, drawing strength from each other's presence. When the clock finally struck 12, we rose and made our way through the fog-shrouded streets to Hampstead, where Violet Pemberton waited in the shadows of her husband's garden. She led us through a side entrance into the house, up a back staircase, and into a small study lined with books and papers. The room smelled of dust and secrets, and in the center of the floor sat a wooden box, its lid already open. "Take it," Violet whispered. "Take it all, and may God forgive me for waiting so long." Theodore knelt beside the box and began to sort through its contents. I watched over his shoulder, my breath catching as document after document revealed the scope of Henry Crow's corruption. Payments to the physician who had certified Elizabeth's death as accidental. Payments to the superintendent at my mother's asylum. Payments to servants, to solicitors, to journalists. A web of bribery and intimidation stretching back a quarter century. And then, at the very bottom of the box, a single sheet of paper that made Theodore go still. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He held up the paper, and I saw that it was a receipt for the purchase of Digitalis, dated 2 days before my father's death. The signature at the bottom was Henry Crow's. The proof was in our hands now. Proof of Elizabeth's murder, proof of my mother's false imprisonment, proof of my father's assassination. Everything we needed to clear my name and expose the truth about Henry Crow. Theodore gathered the documents into his bag, and we slipped out of the house as silently as we had entered. Violet remained behind, a ghostly figure in the darkened hallway, her hand raised in farewell, or perhaps in blessing. As we walked through the fog toward the waiting cab, Theodore took my hand and squeezed it tightly. "It is almost over," he said quietly. "Tomorrow I will take these documents to the authorities. By the end of the week, your name will be cleared." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let myself feel relief. Joy, hope for the future we might still have together. But something was nagging at me, a detail I could not quite place, a piece of the puzzle that did not fit. "Theodore," I said slowly, "if Crow killed my father to prevent him from confessing, why write the letter accusing me? Why not simply let the matter rest? With my father dead and my mother already gone, who would ever have discovered the truth?" Theodore frowned, considering the question. Perhaps he feared you might investigate your father's death. Perhaps he wanted to ensure that even if suspicion arose, it would be directed at you rather than at him. "Perhaps," I agreed. But there was something else, something in the timing that troubled me. The letter was to be read at midnight. The newspaper article appeared only days later. Someone made sure this scandal became public as quickly as possible. Someone wanted me destroyed, not just suspected, but ruined beyond any hope of recovery. "You think there was an accomplice?" Theodore said slowly. "Someone working with Crow, or perhaps continuing his work after his death." "I think," I said, my voice tight with a fear I could not name, "that we have not yet seen the full picture. And until we do, we cannot let down our guard." The fog swirled around us, thick and cold and impenetrable. And somewhere in that fog, I sensed a presence watching, waiting, planning the next move in a game I was only beginning to understand. The dead had accused me. The living had conspired against me. And the truth, the whole truth, was still waiting to be uncovered. The truth, when it finally emerged, came not from the documents we had gathered or the testimony we had prepared, but from an unexpected confession that shattered the last illusions I had held about my family. Theodore delivered the evidence to Scotland Yard the morning after our midnight visit to Violet's home. Inspector Graves, a weathered man with sharp eyes and a reputation for incorruptibility, examined the documents with growing astonishment. By noon, he had dispatched officers to question Violet Pemberton. By evening, the investigation into my father's death had been officially reopened, and the newspapers that had so gleefully condemned me were scrambling to print retractions. But it was not enough. The accusation had been made, and accusations once spoken leave stains that no amount of evidence can fully remove. I knew that even if I were cleared of all suspicion, there would always be whispers, always be doubts, always be those who believed that where there was smoke, there must have been fire. I was sitting alone in my father's study, surrounded by the ghosts of my childhood, when the knock came at the door. Mrs. Bramley had gone to bed hours ago, and I was not expecting visitors. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lamp, wondering if I should pretend I was not home. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and with it a voice I had not heard in years. "Eleanor, please, I know you are there. I must speak with you." I froze. The voice was familiar, achingly so, and yet it could not be. It could not possibly be. I rose and made my way to the front door, my heart pounding against my ribs. I opened it slowly, and there, standing in the lamplight, was a woman I had believed dead for nearly 17 years. My mother. She was older, of course, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined with the marks of time and suffering. But her eyes were the same, those deep brown eyes that I remembered from my earliest childhood, filled now with tears and desperate hope. "Catherine," I whispered, because I could not call her mother. Not yet. Not until I understood. "You are supposed to be dead." She shook her head, and a sob escaped her throat. "May I come in?" "Please, Eleanor. I will explain everything." I stepped aside, numb with shock, and watched as my mother entered the house where she had once lived, where she had been dragged away in the grip of men who called her mad. She moved slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the familiar objects that had remained unchanged in all the years of her absence. "How?" I asked when I finally found my voice. "The asylum told us you died. There was a funeral, a grave, a headstone with your name." My mother sank into a chair, her hands trembling in her lap. "The asylum lied," she said quietly. "Henry Crowe paid them to lie. He staged my death so that I could disappear completely, so that no one would ever think to look for me, so that the secrets I carried would be buried forever." I felt the room spinning around me. "But where have you been?" "For 17 years. Where have you been?" She looked up at me, and the pain in her eyes was bottomless. "He kept me," she said. "Crowe. He had a house in the countryside, in Devon, far from anyone who might recognize me. He hired nurses to care for me, guards to watch me, servants who were paid to see nothing and say nothing. I was his prisoner, Eleanor. I was alive, but I was not free." I sank into the chair across from her, my legs no longer able to support my weight. "Why? Why go to such lengths? Why not simply let the asylum keep you?" "Because I was not mad," my mother said, and there was a fierce clarity in her voice that I had never heard before. "The doctors at the asylum began to suspect that my condition was not what Henry had claimed. They questioned my diagnosis, requested second opinions, threatened to release me. Henry could not allow that. If I were released, I might talk. I might tell someone about Elizabeth, about what I had seen, about what I knew. So he removed me from the asylum entirely, faked my death, and locked me away where no one would ever find me. I thought of the notebooks I had read, the letters to the dead, the rambling entries about voices and visions. "You were writing to Elizabeth," I said slowly. "All those years, you were writing to a woman you believed had been murdered." My mother nodded. "Elizabeth was my dearest friend. When she died, when I realized what Henry had done, something broke inside me. I began to hear her voice, see her face, feel her presence around me. The doctors called it madness. Perhaps it was. But it was also the truth. Elizabeth had been murdered, and no one believed me. No one except your father, and by then it was too late." "Father knew," I said. "He helped Crowe cover it up." My mother's expression twisted with something that might have been contempt or might have been grief. "Your father was weak," she said quietly. "He was a good man in his way, but he was weak. Henry threatened him, showed him evidence that could have destroyed his career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, and William chose to save himself rather than do what was right. He signed the papers that committed me. He accepted Henry's money. He helped bury the truth about Elizabeth, and then he spent the rest of his life trying to live with what he had done. I felt tears streaming down my face, though I had not been aware of crying. He was going to confess, I said. Before he died, he wrote to Crow, told him he intended to go to the police. I know, my mother said. Henry told me. He came to see me 2 weeks before your father died. He was agitated, furious. He said William had lost his nerve, that he was going to ruin everything, that something had to be done. And then, she paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And then he left. And a week later, your father was dead. The pieces were falling into place now, a terrible mosaic of betrayal and murder spanning decades. But one question remained, the question that had haunted me since I first read Crow's letter. Why accuse me? I asked. Why, after everything? Did he choose to destroy me? My mother was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her traveling cloak and withdrew a folded paper, creased and worn from handling. Because of this, she said. She held out the paper to me, and I took it with trembling hands. It was a letter, written in my own hand, dated 3 months before my father's death. Dear Mr. Crow, the letter began. I write to you regarding a matter of great delicacy. I have recently discovered certain documents among my father's papers that suggest a relationship between your family and mine extending back many years. I do not yet understand the nature of this relationship, but I am determined to uncover the truth. If you have any information that might help me understand my family's history, I would be most grateful for an opportunity to speak with you in person. I stared at the letter, my heart pounding. I remember writing this, I whispered. I found some of Father's old correspondence, letters from Crow that I did not understand. I was curious, nothing more. I had no idea what I was stirring up. But Henry did, my mother said grimly. When he received your letter, he panicked. He believed you had discovered something, that you were on the verge of exposing him. He decided that you had to be discredited, destroyed, before you could reveal the truth. The letter he wrote accusing you of murder was his insurance policy. If you ever came close to uncovering his secrets, the accusation would ensure that no one would believe you. I felt sick. He destroyed my life because of a letter. A simple letter asking questions. He destroyed many lives, my mother said. Elizabeth, your father, me. And he would have destroyed you too, if he had lived long enough. She paused, then added quietly, but he did not live. And now, at last, the truth can be told. I looked at this woman, this stranger who was also my mother, and I felt a tumult of emotions I could not begin to name. Grief for the years we had lost, anger at the man who had stolen them, and beneath it all, a desperate, tentative hope. How did you escape? I asked. How are you here now? She smiled, and for a moment I saw the woman she had been before tragedy had claimed her, beautiful and gentle and full of life. When Henry died, she said, the payments stopped. The nurses and guards who had watched over me for so many years suddenly found themselves without employment. Most of them left immediately, but one of them, a woman named Martha, who had shown me small kindnesses over the years, she stayed. She told me what had happened, that Henry was dead, that the world believed I had been in my grave for 17 years, and she helped me escape. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed. All this time, I whispered, all this time, you were alive, and I never knew. My mother rose and crossed the space between us. She knelt before my chair and took my hands in hers, and I felt the warmth of her touch, the solid reality of her presence. I am here now, she said softly, and I intend to make things right. I will testify to what I know. I will tell the world who Henry Crow truly was, and I will spend whatever years remain to me trying to be the mother you deserved. I fell into her arms then, and we held each other, Two women who had been separated by lies and madness and the machinations of a monster finally reunited in the wreckage of his destruction. The trial, when it came, was the sensation of the decade. Violet Pemberton testified to what she had witnessed on the night of Elizabeth Reed's death, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. My mother told her story, from the early days of her friendship with Elizabeth through the long years of her imprisonment, and the courtroom sat in stunned silence as the truth finally emerged. The documents from Crow's study provided irrefutable evidence of his crimes, the receipt for digitalis, the payments to corrupt officials, the letters revealing his threats against my father. One by one, the pieces fell into place, painting a portrait of a man who had spent his entire life manipulating and destroying anyone who threatened his secrets. I was cleared of all suspicion. The newspapers that had condemned me now praised my courage and resilience. Letters of apology arrived by the dozens, from society matrons and former friends and complete strangers who had believed the lies and now wished to make amends. But I took no satisfaction in their apologies. The damage had been done. My reputation had been torn apart and hastily stitched back together, and the scars would always be visible to those who looked closely enough. Theodore stood by me through it all. He sat beside me in the courtroom, held my hand during the most difficult testimony, and shielded me from the reporters who clamored for interviews. When the verdict was announced, when the world finally acknowledged that I was innocent, he turned to me with tears in his eyes and asked me once more to be his wife. I said yes. We were married in December, in a small ceremony attended only by family and close friends. My mother was there, still fragile but growing stronger each day, a woman slowly learning to live again after nearly 2 decades of captivity. Violet Pemberton came as well, her guilt finally purged by her testimony, her conscience clear for the first time in 25 years. The wedding took place in a country church in Kent, far from the gossip and scandal of London. Snow fell softly outside the windows as Theodore and I exchanged our vows, and I thought of all the obstacles we had overcome to reach this moment, the accusations, the doubts, the secrets that had threatened to tear us apart. But we had survived. We had found our way back to each other, and as Theodore slipped the ring onto my finger and bent to kiss me, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt hope. After the ceremony, as the guests gathered in the reception hall for champagne and cake, I slipped away to the church's small graveyard. The snow was falling more heavily now, blanketing the headstones in white, and I walked among them until I found the one I was looking for. Elizabeth Reed, the stone read, 1841-1864. Beloved daughter and friend, may she rest in peace. Theodore had arranged for the headstone to be placed here, in the churchyard near his family's estate, after the trial had concluded. Elizabeth's body had been buried in an unmarked grave in London, forgotten and unmourned, but now she had a resting place worthy of her memory. I knelt in the snow before her grave and placed a single white rose against the stone. I never knew you, I said softly, but I know what you suffered. And I promise you, Elizabeth, that you will not be forgotten. Your story will be told, your memory will be honored, and the man who took your life has finally been exposed for what he was. The wind stirred the bare branches of the trees overhead, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I heard a voice on the wind, a woman's voice, gentle and grateful, whispering words I could not quite make out. Perhaps it was only my imagination. Perhaps it was the echo of my mother's visions, passed down through blood and memory. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the dead truly can speak to those who are willing to listen. I rose and brushed the snow from my skirts, and as I turned to rejoin my husband, I saw Theodore waiting for me at the edge of the graveyard. He held out his hand, and I took it, feeling the warmth of his fingers against my cold skin. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. I looked back at Elizabeth's grave, at the white rose already disappearing beneath a blanket of snow, and I smiled. I am now, I said. We walked back to the church together, hand in hand, as the snow continued to fall around us. The past was finally at rest. The dead had spoken, and the living had listened. And ahead of us lay a future that, for the first time in months, seemed bright with possibility. I had been accused by a dead man, betrayed by secrets I never knew existed, and nearly destroyed by lies that reached back a quarter century. But I had survived. I had found truth and justice and love. And as Theodore and I stepped into the warmth of the reception hall, surrounded by the people who believed in us, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The letter had been read at midnight. The accusations had been made. But in the end, it was not the dead who had the final word. It was the living. And we chose love.